I told somebody, I think somebody's praying for me because I'm losing my voice. Because will keep me quiet. Heroes and sheroes of faith. We're going to talk about Moses in a little bit, and it was about someone who had determined faith. And when I was picking out people from MCC for this, there was one person whose faith has always just really, I don't want to say impressed me in a bad way, but I knew I could trust her that she always had faith. And her name is Reverend Jerry Ann Harvey, and that's a really tiny picture of her. She always had this wonderful white streak in her hair. It's just amazing. And this was in a nationwide, worldwide profile, a little bit of her biography, and then I have a funny story. Reverend Elder Jerry Ann Harvey was born January 3, 1934 in Oklahoma City to a Cherokee Nation family. This heritage was an important aspect of Jerry Ann's identity. Talks about where she went to school. Prior to ministry, she worked as a medical technologist and psychiatric technician. That explains a lot. And with the VA hospitals. And she was published and had written some music. She became a member of MCC in 1972. And the story in this is it was MCC's 1974 General Conference in San Francisco. That would have been probably the fourth or fifth one. I was talking with an MCCer when a young woman stepped between us, flashed a smile, and said, "Let a real butch belly up to the bar." That's how I first met Jerry Ann, and she's been making an impression on me and thousands of others ever since. Jerry Ann was the first female pastor of the mother church at that time, and she pastored there until her health really couldn't sustain being a full-time pastor, so she went into evangelism, traveled all over the country and all over the world. She was just an amazing woman, one of my real sheroes. And this is one of the stories that Nancy shared the night I was there in Raleigh that speaks to Jerry Ann. Talked about how we were just beginning to get some female leadership. Some of the most powerful women leaders were also from evangelical traditions and were more conservative about God's language or Jesus' language. They often felt caught in the middle between more liberal feminist women and men friends and their evangelical colleagues and allies. Reverend Jerry Ann Harvey was an evangelist through and through, pastor of MCC LA. She had Baptist roots and leanings. She was looked to by many as holding the standard, not letting people dilute the message of Jesus. At the same time, she was also drawn to women who were challenging her theology. As a Native American, she had other traditions that expanded and challenged her sense of God and theology. It was all very confusing at times. Reverend Jean White was born and raised in a Plymouth Brethren church in England. She was a national hero in England for all the work she did in China until she came out as a lesbian. In 1981, our General Conference was considering proposals from inclusive language on how churches were to implement inclusive language in their worship. We were at a clergy conference early that year, and it had been hard going for Reverend Perry and MCC leaders, who were the hot spot for many issues. There was lots of drama and trauma. We were investing all of our lives in whatever would become of the movement. One evening, a couple of younger women clergy sought out Jerry Ann and Jean for counseling about how they should vote on inclusive language. It was quite a long evening, and Jerry and Jean, who were rooming together, got to bed quite late, and both were quite agitated. Suddenly, Jean bolted up out of the bed and said, "Jerry Ann, it's the Lord. I heard his voice. He said, 'I am that I am.'" Jerry turned over, looked at the clock, and then at Jean and said, "Jean, that's my talking clock saying it's now 1 a.m. Inclusive language back then was a real issue, and they were trying to really make it understandable. Jerry Ann, when she was pastor of the founding church, the mother church, right after this conference, she came back and she was at the back door presenting the benediction. And Jerry Ann just had a massive presence. And she's there and she says, "Our most gracious Heavenly Father," oh, expletive, right into the microphone. And so that was always kind of funny. But she was just an amazing woman. And she came out here to the church. She was here for several activities. She preached here before. She passed away a few years ago. She was such a strong personality that the first time I was at conference and saw her on a scooter, it just broke my heart. I had to walk around the corner and cry a little bit. But she was just an amazing woman. So tonight we're going to look at Moses. Now, I don't know about you, but a lot of Moses to me is what I've seen on TV and in the movies. It's kind of hard separating the Exodus story from the Ten Commandments movie or some of the newer ones about Moses. Would someone like to read Hebrews 11:23 to 29? I'm going to wait you out this week.
I'll read. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt unafraid of the king's anger, for he preserved as thought he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel.
One more. One more verse.
29?
Yeah.
By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what we know already or think we know about the life of Moses. I had a pastor one time, I said, you know, you remind me of Moses, back when I was in high school, and he looked at me, he said, I don't know how I like that. Moses spent 40 years being somebody. He spent 40 years wandering around being nobody, and he spent the last 40 years being God's somebody. He said, I don't know if I want to live 120 years. So what do you know about Moses? Some of this we read. Anything about him?
He grew up privileged.
He grew up privileged. He didn't start out privileged. He started out in a Hebrew family after the king had said he wanted all baby boys killed. But then he stepped into the Pharaoh's family and lived a life of privilege. What else? He was willing to listen to God. One of my favorite pictures in my little Bible I got when I was in elementary school has a picture of Moses standing in front of the burning bush barefoot. And I remember being so fascinated that he was standing there barefoot. I don't know why that impressed me so much. But he listened to God even when it didn't make any sense to him. Do you think he was a good leader? He must have been a good leader if these people walked through a river rolled back for him, the sea. Do you know why he didn't get to go into the promised land? There's some fascinating stories in Exodus. People needed water. And the time before when they needed water, God told him to take a stick and hit the rock. The water came out. So down the road, they've been marching around, walking around in circles, and they're thirsty again. And Moses goes, I know this trick. Before he even asked God, he went over and hit the rock. The water didn't come out. And God said, did I ask you to do that? This is Catherine's free translation. Did I ask you to do that? And because of that disobedience, he was not allowed to go into the promised land. He got to go on the mountain and look over, but he wasn't allowed to go in. I encourage you sometime when you're really bored and have nothing else to do, to read the book of Exodus, because it kind of takes what you think you know and shows you what really happened. The initial step of faith did not come from Moses, but from his parents, verse 23. Even though Scripture doesn't give us many clues, what factors can you think of that may have made them recognize that Moses was not an ordinary child?
He was beautiful.
Said he was beautiful. You know, and that word that gets defined as beautiful here also has an idea of just not ordinary in the word itself. You know, there's beautiful and there's beautiful. He had that extreme look of being a beautiful child. We don't know all the details. We don't know if his parents had some understanding. At this time in the Bible, God was showing up and telling people stuff. He may have told them that. I love the story of how they preserved his life, put him in that little basket, and didn't just send him down the river. First time I heard that story, I thought it was kind of scary, until I realized the role his sister played in going with him and making sure he was picked up and taken care of. They were obviously thinking there was something special because they were being in defiance of the Pharaoh, of the king. What happened to people who disobeyed the king in these times? Usually they got killed. Usually they got killed. And especially being a Hebrew family who were slaves in Egypt, having defied the king, that would put them right up there on the line. And if not them, they would have found that child and would have killed it. No ordinary child, a beautiful child. I think it's too that, whatever prompted them, they were being obedient first to God. Sometimes when we obey God, it doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always make sense. Look at the next question. The second stage of Moses' faith journey involved identifying himself with his own people. There were two decisions involved in identification, verses 24 and 26. Explain the two decisions and the consequences. Let me read those again, verse 24 and 26 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. So what two decisions did he make at this juncture in his life? One was a yes and one was a no.
He chose the hard life.
He chose the hard life. He chose to identify with his people. Now in the movie it's real dramatic how that came about. You will find all that in Exodus. But he chose to be identified with his people. And it wasn't just being identified with his people. Like Sandra said, it was the hard life. He chose that hard life to be with his people. He got a glimpse of what it was all about. What was the other decision he made? Kind of goes along with this one. When he chose to be with his people, what did he leave?
Egypt.
The Egyptian family, the king's family, the palace. That's a big decision to make. And wouldn't it be easier just to kind of like help them out rather than leaving everything and going? But he knew that that was not the plan God had. So he chose to identify with the group he really should be with. And that meant leaving his life of pleasure. I don't think even our 1800s society compares to what it meant to leave the house of Pharaoh and go to be with the Hebrews, the slaves. We can't imagine how rich and opulent and easy his life was. But the minute he stepped to the other side, he became nobody. He became just another one of those Israelites. What sign of success in our culture might God ask us to turn from as an expression of our confident trust in God? Well, it might mean, in some cases, who your partner is going to be. Have you ever known somebody that seemed like he or she was the one? And God gave you this little jiggle. Just asking. It might be whether to take a promotion. What if you got a promotion offered to you tomorrow that required you to work every Sunday and every Tuesday evening? But it was a good promotion. Think about the money. Just something to think about. Another idea might be just how we use our time. I want to get home quick on Tuesday nights because NCIS comes on at 8 o'clock.
I thought when he told me that he was joking. Tell the truth, don't worry.
And,
Are you TV obsessed like her?
I was asked to do a Bible study in Norfolk when I came back from California. And I said, fine, but I can't do it on Wednesday. And the pastor says, why? I said, I have a previous commitment. So we did it on Tuesdays. My previous commitment was peel and eat shrimp at Hershey Bar on Wednesday nights, 10-cent shrimp. I'm not sure that disillusioned anybody or, upset God, but, we make those choices. It may mean a choice of the group you run with, your circle of friends. because I don't know about you, but I can be very easily influenced by people I'm around without even realizing it, especially when it comes to language. I contend that if you hang around with people that cuss a lot, it's a whole lot easier to cuss. Just saying from personal experience. Or if you're around a lot of people that drink all the time, then it's easier to fall into that. So it's those choices that we think of Moses making this dramatic choice, but every day we come up against choices. The choice whether to gossip or not. The choice whether to talk down about somebody. I like the thing that says, be careful if somebody's talking to you and you walk away and they start talking about you. So we have those choices, not as dramatic necessarily as Moses, but we have those choices. What reward was Moses looking for? It's interesting how this gets translated, verse 26. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. And then another translation says, he refused a hard life, he refused the privilege of the Egyptian household and chose to be with the hard life with God's people rather than optimistic. He valued suffering in Messiah's camp far greater than Egyptian wealth. What was he looking for? It's kind of hard to think of Moses looking for Christ. It's a long wait.
What the promised land, what they were promised.
The promised land. He believed, and he had been taught, like they'd been taught, those promises to Abraham that we studied way back. The Hebrew people, through all their captivity, through all their slavehood, still believed that the Messiah was going to come and lead them back to that promised land. I don't think Moses took that title very well, but he knew that God had a bigger plan. And he was willing to sacrifice what had to be done for that. Sometimes we have to back off and say, not what I want necessarily, but what does God want in this situation? It's not my particular choice, but what does God want? You think about that sometimes when decisions come up around church. We may individually, some of us may individually want certain things. We have to back off and try to pray and see what God wants. Just think about my talk with Brendan today. You know, he and I think along a lot of the same tracks. And we were talking about what kind of person we would want for the moderator. And we both agreed that apart from what we want, we need to back off and hope that we find God's person for that. It's going to be a real make or break decision for this denomination. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian, waiting for God's deliverance of the Israelites. How can we, like Moses, keep our eyes on God as we wait for God's fulfillment and God's promises? Moses knew that they had to have a deliverer. Everybody kept telling him it was him. Not initially. He spent that time in the wilderness, growing into that role. What do you think made him keep doing that? The people had been in captivity for hundreds of years. Now suddenly he's supposed to lead them to the promised land. What would have kept him secure in believing that's what God wanted?
Just his faith in God.
His faith in God. He surely didn't have a Bible to read. What else?
It's kind of like what you were saying earlier about who you surround yourself with. If he has people around him saying, you've got this, it's going to be a lot easier to keep that faith.
And if you read the book of Exodus, you'll find that sometimes he had people around telling him, you've got this, and other times he had people around saying, you shouldn't be doing this to us. I love this part in Exodus when they finally get across the Red Sea, talk about in a minute, and they get to the other side and things start getting rough. And what do the people whine and say? Oh, let's go back to Egypt. I want to go back to my cucumbers and onions. You want to go back and be a slave, or you want to go back and eat cucumbers and onions? Crazy. So he had that to struggle with. I think he, like you said, with the encouragement, he first got the encouragement with the burning bush. We don't know that Moses even understood who God was until that happened. God told him, what did God tell him down the road, if you remember, when people started coming to him with every little bitty problem they had? And they'd line up outside Moses' tent and come and bring all their problems to him. Do you remember what God did? God said, pick a board of directors. God said, pick some people that you trust and empower them to handle some of these issues. When he got ready to cross the Red Sea, and he's holding, remember the movie, he's holding up the stick, the water's crossing, opening up, and it takes a long time to get several 100,000 people across that. When his arms started getting tired, do you remember what God did? Well, I got to do some teaching here. He sent Aaron and others to hold his arm up. Not to take over and do it for him, but to hold him up during that time.
See, I never knew.
See?
I never knew.
Read that book of Exodus. I didn't mean to be disparaging when I said a lot of teaching to it. It's just I love the Old Testament. I love those stories. And I love reading the stories and trying to see what else they're talking about. That it's not just a big storybook. There's stuff behind each one of these. If you remember when Moses wanted to help the people out, he didn't immediately start by leading them out into the wilderness. He did something before that really could have gotten him killed in the Egyptian culture. He saw an Egyptian fighting with an Israelite, and he killed the Egyptian. I think he was kind of wanting to hurry up and get things going. He killed the Egyptian, and that could have caused him to have been killed right then. Sometimes we try to short circuit God. God, I know you want ABC, but boy, I've got this plan D, and it's a whole lot better and a whole lot quicker. But we can't really even try to do that. Look at question 7. Gets actually into the Exodus story. Turn, if you will, to Exodus chapter 12. I'm going to read for you verses 21 to 36, Exodus chapter 12. I'm going to read it from the Message just because it's different. Moses assembled all the elders of Egypt. He said, select a lamb for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the bowl of blood and smear it on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts. No one is to leave the house until morning. God will pass through to strike Egypt down. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, God will pass over the doorway. He won't let the destroyer enter your home to strike you down with ruin. Keep this word. It's the law for you. For you and your children forever, when you enter the land which God will give you as he promised Abraham. Keep doing this. And when your children say to you, why are we doing this? Tell them and say, the Passover sacrifice to God who passed over the homes of the Israelites in Egypt when he hit Egypt with death but rescued us. The people bowed and worshipped. The Israelites then went and did what God had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did it all. Have any problems with that story? What aspect of God's character are revealed in the account of the Passover? What do you hear about God in that story? Is God weak or powerful? Powerful. Does God have any mercy in that story? On the Israelite people. It's always been a struggle with me with that story. But you know, we forget that the killing of the firstborn was not the first plague. You know, they had to go through all those other things. The water turned into blood and all the bugs that came and all the other things that came. Horrible. But God kept saying, let my people go. Pharaoh would say, no, he'd go, okay, have this. Let my people go. And then the cool thing is, one time Pharaoh says, sure, they can go, but they have to leave their children. Or he let them go out just a little ways and then said, come back. Kind of teasing with that. But then it comes down to the death of the firstborn. If you ever watched any of the TV shows, Science TV, or any of those, it has great theories about how all this happened. How because one thing died, it brought these bugs and this one and this one. But the one about the death of the firstborn I always thought was really interesting. This is not biblical.
The grain.
The grain?
Got the most, first child got the most portion, and the grain was contaminated or something.
Well, they say the grain may have been tampered with or had been rotten, and the oldest one got the most. Also, the oldest one got the best place to sleep, which would have been down low, and all these things had died, and you know, all the rot that would come with that, and that the fumes came up and killed the firstborns. I just kind of like to think that God did it whatever way God wanted to do it, but it's kind of interesting to see how these plagues escalated on this. Do you think the Israelites would have had any trouble marking these doorposts, lintels this part, doorposts this part, with the blood of the lamb? The Israelites, the Jewish faith, is really funny about blood. You know, they just don't want to mess with it. They don't want to even, you know, there are only certain animals they can mess with anyhow. So I've always thought that took a little bit of faith to go, okay, here we do, you know, and to stay in. Now I know some of you, you're nosy as I am. As soon as the noise started, wouldn't you want to peek out and see what was going on?
Oh, yeah.
Some of you would be silly enough to go on out, probably, you know. But God told them through Moses, you gotta stay. You gotta stay in. I can't imagine, even though the slave headquarters were way over here, and the rest of Egypt was way over here, I can't imagine sounds and the noise that must have come about as those children. Not just children. We always think of the children, you know, but I'm a firstborn. How many of you are firstborn? Yeah, we've gone too, even when we were grown-ups, adults. So do you find it difficult to trust in a God who deals so severely with those who oppose God?
I got a question.
Okay?
If one of your parents was firstborn, does that mean them too?
Yeah, yeah. It was firstborn, not firstborn children, not firstborn middle-aged adults, firstborn anybody. But in most of the movies, it only shows, it talks about children. It said firstborn. Any difficulty with this story? I think God was pretty patient to make it all the way through 9 before he got to 10 plagues.
I find it interesting that it says to keep this law forever. My brain's kind of drawing a parallel with communion.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, you know, do this to remember and to keep it in your minds.
Right, because this was a miracle, a major miracle that they weren't killed. And it's really easy, isn't it easy to forget when God does something really great for you? And you're going down the road and things get a little rough and we forget how great God was and how good God was to us. That's why I'm always encouraging people to keep a blessings list. So when times are rough, you can go back and say, okay, I don't get it right now, God, but I know you did this and this and this. And it was like communion. It was very much like communion because there was nobody getting ready to be killed 20 years down the road or 200 years down the road. But it had happened to their forefathers and foremothers. They were saved. This was to remind them that it was God who saved them. It was God who saved them. Same thing with communion. Why do we do communion every Sunday? That was really weird to me when I came in because, you know, growing up Baptists, we did it maybe once a quarter. Some churches don't even do it but once a year. And here we're up here doing this every Sunday. What's the point? Loaded question. To remember. But the reason Troy instituted that was so that if you walked in that door and you'd been denied communion for years and years and years, or you'd never been told you were worthy to take communion, you would get it that day. As opposed to saying, well, I know you'd really like to have communion, I know you've been denied it, but come back in 3 months, we'll do it next quarter. So it's a matter of remembering, Why did it require faith for Moses and the Israelites to follow God's instruction about the lamb and the blood? It took faith because it was brand new. Nobody had done this before. The final step of Moses, highlighted in Hebrews 11, is the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 14. Moses, how was the act of faith for Moses and the Israelites as a whole. How was it an act of faith? This is one of the dumbest questions I've ever seen one of these. An act of faith. You know, again, you see people telling you it was the Reed Sea and it was only knee high and whatever, whatever. Whatever the water was, there was varmints in it. Whatever the water was, it parted and people walked across on dry land. Now that makes no sense, does it? I mean, you know, even if it rolled back, the silt to the junk would still be there. I don't understand. But Bible said it was dry land. Why was it an act of faith? What's going to keep the water from coming back? How many of you would volunteer to be the first one across? Only if I was running real fast. That ain't going to happen. You know, they had already seen God do these 10 plagues. It might have been hard to believe and trust God after the first couple, or after the first 5 or 6, or 7 or 8. But by 10, I hope they would have seen that God was on their side and that God wanted them to be able to get away. But it still would have taken a little bit of faith to walk out with these, what I vision, walls of water beside you. What made them do that? What made them go across?
You get it, he's gonna be killed for the people following you.
The Egyptians were after them. They'd probably be killed or at least taken back into slavery, one or the other.
They believed in Moses.
They believed Moses, and they believed the God of Moses. What's interesting when you read this story, you find out that it wasn't just the Israelites who left. There were a lot of Egyptians who left also. Because, you know, it's like in today's society. There were the pharaohs, and there were the slaves. And there was probably a big gap between the top and the bottom here. Egypt didn't have a lot of middle class. You had money, or you had nothing, or you were a slave. So a lot of people were looking for a better way doing that. The final step of faith for Moses, crossing the Red Sea. Fear of drowning, fear that you couldn't walk fast enough, fear you get in the middle and Moses loses his arm, you know, and come down. I'm being silly, but for a long time I had just had this vision. They all just said, okay, let's go. You know, but when you think about what it took to do that, even with Pharaoh behind them, are they going to get killed or are they going to drown? Or is God going to be true to God's word and take them across? Have you ever seen one person's faith influence a larger group the way Moses did? Because a lot of this was personality based. They didn't have the story. They didn't have the back of the book. Moses said, God told me this. Moses said, God told me that. You ever seen anybody have that kind of faith influence? I thought of 2 examples. One is Troy, obviously. Troy who believed people would come. Troy who believed people would keep coming. Troy who didn't have a clue it was going to be as widespread as it became. The other person I thought about in a much quieter way was Jimmy Carter, President Carter. Anything you see in the news or you read on Facebook or anything about him is almost always faith-based. And he's been very outspoken about what our country needs around faith. Now, there are people who have had influence to get people to believe their version of the faith. But I think about how Jimmy Carter, I won't be alive in 50 years, but I think it'd be interesting 50 years from now to see how history looks at him and looks at what he did in office and then out of office also. So the question that can only probably be answered in our hearts is, what situation is your personal Egypt that you have to trust God for deliverance from? Nobody in here is a slave. I don't know. Wanda may make Wendy try. No, I'm sorry. No one in here is a slave.
Wendy might be doing maybe.
But you know, slave is not just the brand on you or the job you have. What kind of things, not being personal, what kind of things could be enslaving to people?
Addiction.
Any kind of addiction. Any kind of addiction. And I say any kind because it's not just drugs and alcohol. Could be work. Could be ego. Could be family. Family can almost be an addiction sometimes. What else could enslave us? Money. I had a 7th grade reading teacher, Ms. Wilson. She misquoted that verse about money is the root of all evil. It says the love of money, but she'd say, money's the root of all evil, but I need some of that root. But money can enslave us, and what we'll do, what compromises we'll make on our jobs or in our life.
Possessions that we desire.
Possessions we desire. Sometimes I think our self-doubt can also be an oppression, can also be a slavery. I can't do that, I never could do that, I never will do that, I'm never going to be good enough. And we get trapped and enslaved with that.
Depression. Depression.
Depression. Depression. And I believe that God will part those Red Seas in God's time, and sometimes it's with medication, sometimes it's with 12-step, sometimes it's just an awareness of it's not worth it. It's not worth it. I've always had an issue with comparing myself to other people. You know, I'm not as smart as they are, I'm not as talented as they are. You know, and finally, the last few years, I've gotten to the point of who cares? I am who I am, you know, and I'll do what I can do. But it took a long time for me to get there, and it doesn't always stay gone. Moses with a long and abiding faith. We don't see a lot, even in the Exodus account, about how Moses really kept doing it. We talked about having people surround him, even though he saw these miracles of God. But I wonder, because he didn't just have these people to lead, he had these whiny people. He had these people that were getting discouraged, but you know, when they started doing the tabernacle, every time they moved, they had to pack that tabernacle up, all the stuff with it, take it with them. One of my friends in North Carolina said, no wonder they were whiny, having to take that apart and putting it up all the time. But I believe that Moses had a trust and a vision. And his vision was that his people, God's people, were going to be set free. And he stood on it. So I'd be interested if you have a chance to go back and read Exodus anytime soon. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on it. We have one more session with this study. And somebody was asking, I think we'll have maybe 1 week before Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving week, we'll have a Wednesday night service, so we won't have the Tuesday night Bible study. And then during Advent, from 6:30 to 7 over in the chapel, we'll have an Advent service, quiet meditation, and then we'll have Bible study on at 7 o'clock as usual. And we're going to spend those 4 weeks of Bible study looking at the Christmas story. Different ways of looking at it. If you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 2 of them don't even mention it. And looking at why. And the 2 that do mention it, their stories don't match. I mean, you get bored or not. How does that happen? But their stories don't match, so we'll be looking at that. The lesson for next week is about Rahab. Tell me something about Rahab, anybody? What was her profession? Say what? She was a prostitute. And she helped the Israelite nation survive. She also shows up in the New Testament. Why does she show up in the New Testament? How does this prostitute from way back in the Old Testament show up in the New Testament?
Wasn't Jesus descended from her?
She was the great grandmother of Jesus. So it'll be interesting to see about her story and what she did that talked about facing our fears. Yep. Say what?
There's still hope for Pat.
Well, now there is something in this story, this whole account with Rahab, that does tell us that God uses whom God chooses to use. Y'all hear that? God uses whom God chooses to use, whether it's who we would pick or not. Again, let me go back to Troy for a minute. Here was Troy ready to commit suicide, and God says, no, you're going to start a church. Any last minute prayer requests or praises?
Wait for Dean.
It's amazing, it's amazing the way we love each other. Would you pray with me? Loving God, help us to continue to have that strong faith that Moses had, even when people aren't encouraging of us, even when people don't seem to understand what we're doing or why we do it. And give us a faith that would enable us to follow you, even through a parted sea, to keep our eyes on you, knowing that you know the end story. Not just the end story in the Bible, but the end story for our lives. We give you thanks and praise for your word that has some of the strangest little parts in it, but has truth. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.